Hey everybody, I am Michael Symon. Welcome to a little bit of Meat 101. Today, it's all about the braise. So we're gonna start with some braised pork shanks. Now, the first thing that we're gonna do before we start braising the pork shanks is I typically do not brine my meat when I'm roasting and smoking, etc. But I do like to brine with a braise. It allows me to get a little bit more flavor in it in a shorter amount of time, and also allows all the seasoning to penetrate all the meat. So I tend to brine with the braise. Now, a basic brine recipe that is our standard in all of our recipes and at our restaurants is we always go with a gallon of liquid, in this case water, a half cup of sugar, and 1 cup of salt. Now, that's the basic ratio. With the sugar, you could do it with maple syrup. You could do it with honey. You could pick different things to sweeten it to change the flavor of your brine. Salt is salt, and then any seasonings that you want to add to impart more flavor into the brine, those go into. Today we're going to use coriander, black peppercorns, garlic, bay leaf, and rosemary. So a couple quick tips before you get started. If you have the time, you're going to start with your gallon of water, you're going to heat it up, you're going to add all your liquids to it till your sugar and salt dissolve, then you're good to go. You just have to chill your liquid. If you're in a little bit more of a hurry, you could start with essentially a third amount of water, bring it up to temperature, and the other 2/3 of the gallon would be in ice, and you could chill it very quickly. So in this case though, we have plenty of time, a lot of time today, we're just chilling out. So I have the gallon of water, we brought it up to a simmer and shut it off on our stovetop. To that, I'm going to add a half cup of sugar, 1 cup of salt, a tablespoon of coriander seeds, whole, toasted, and a tablespoon of black peppercorns, 1 bay leaf. I'm going to take a whole head of garlic and just split it in half. Throw the whole garlic in there, and 2 sprigs of rosemary. Once everything is in there, you're just going to give it a quick whisk, and you'll be able to see when the sugar and salt essentially dissolve. If you need to get your water a little bit hotter, you just bring it up to temp and you're good. Once everything is dissolved, we want to get this liquid back down to 35 degrees. You could do that in a fridge or in an ice bath, but just check it with your thermometer. Once it's at 35, you're good to go. So the brine is ready, press pause, and we're going to be on to our next step. All right, you guys, so your brine has chilled. We've brought it back out of the refrigerator. It's at a nice 35 degrees, very brisk. We have our 6 pork shanks. We're now going to submerge them into the brine and then weigh them down. Now, in a perfect situation, we would let these sit. Hey, everybody in the cold tub. In a perfect situation, we would let these sit overnight in the fridge to really absorb all that seasoning, some of the spices that we put in there. Minimally though, for a brine, 8 hours. Overnight, up to 12, you're good. So we put them in. I like to place a plate on top to make sure that they stay down submerged in the brine, nothing floats up. These go back in the fridge now. It's very heavy, it's a little evening workout. So these go back in the fridge. We are going to leave them in there overnight. When I come back to see you in the morning, make sure you have your oven preset to 300 degrees, and we're going to start cooking up these shanks. All right, everybody, we are back. Your oven should be set at 300 degrees. We have taken our pork in the brine out of the refrigerator. It went overnight, kind of minimum 8, maximum 12 hours in that brine. This is the plate that weighed it down. Just gonna place that in the sink. And now we're gonna let these just dry off a touch before we bread them or flour them and then sear them. Just go into a sheet tray here with a towel. You can just roll them around on the towel to make sure you get off as much of that liquid as you can. All right. And be careful because they're slippery little suckers at this point. Now, a pork shank, so everybody knows, if you were looking at a hog, at the bottom part of the leg is the shank, kind of below the knee, between the knee and the foot is the shank. It is a tougher cut of meat, but it has an incredible amount of flavor. It has nice intermuscular fat. It has a decent amount of external fat. If this was veal shank, we would be calling this ossobuco in a classic Italian dish. But this is a pork shank, so it's the same cut that would come off a veal or a steer or whatever kind of shank you're cooking, a lamb. Again, great depth of flavor, but it needs to cook for a long time to get tender. The reason that we brine this is, as I said earlier, I don't always love to brine when I'm roasting because texturally it really changes the meat to me. With a braised cut of meat, because this is a long cooking procedure and you're continuing to kind of pump moisture into the meat as it's cooking, the texture of the meat doesn't change from a classical braise. But what the brine does allow you is to get a little bit more depth of flavor in there, and it actually helps the meat set up a little bit better too. So this is our brining liquid. At this point, you do not need it anymore. We are just going to dump it in our sink, and we are done with that. Now, for the searing, I'm doing this in a roasting pan because this recipe that we're doing, we're feeding a lot of people. A lot of people are coming over the Symons today. So we have 6 shanks. 6 shanks could feed 6 Vikings or about 12 regular people. If I was cooking for my father, my grandfather, Kyle, and so forth, and there were 6 of us, I would do 6. If I had a normal family that didn't eat an excessive amount of meat, this could feed 12, no problem. These are pretty large shanks. Remember, there is a bone in the middle and the exterior is meat, but a braised cut of meat like this, especially a shank, is very rich, so a little goes a long way. We just kind of flip these to get the rest of that moisture off. And then I'm gonna dredge them in a little bit of seasoned flour. Now, I don't have to season these shanks again because they've been sitting in the brine. Remember, we put peppercorns in the brine and we also put a good amount of salt in the brine. So the meat itself is seasoned. But what you don't want to happen is you don't want to have your meat seasoned and then dredge something in flour and the flour isn't seasoned, so you kind of have like a bland exterior to your meat. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on my burners. So this is going to start to get hot. Whenever I'm over medium heat here. When you are cooking at home, get your pan hot, add your fat, let the fat get hot, then add your protein. Don't put a pan on the stove and start throwing things into it. You're not going to caramelize things properly. Things are going to stick, all kinds. It becomes just a big hot mess. So for our flour, I'm going to put in a pinch of salt. This is all-purpose flour. If you are trying to eliminate gluten from your diet, which a lot of people are for some reason these days, you could use rice flour here. It will still work, or another gluten-free flour will work also. I'm going to spin my board here, put my flour. Our pan is now hot. I'm using a canola oil, canola, corn, olive oil, any of those will work. Pick a fat, any fat. Lard would be great if your grocer has lard. And you're going for a decent amount of fat in here because you need to brown all sides of your pork. Now we're going to take this, go from here to flour to fat. So we just make sure that all sides are floured. Shake off any of the excess flour. And in it goes. Same thing with this guy. And then when you're browning a shank, or when you're browning any meat that you are about to braise, the key kind of to this is patience. There is a lot of flavor that happens in the browning of the meat before the braise. So you don't want to short yourself on this. You want to get it brown on all sides. And that's where a lot of the depth of flavor comes in. It's also going to allow the base of the pan to caramelize a little bit, which is going to create, we call it a fond, but just a little bit of caramelization and delicious bits on the bottom of the pan that are going to work its way back into our sauce. So 2 more to go. Get a couple straight peppercorns there. Just lay this one in. All right. So all of our shanks are in. I'm going to clean up and then we'll continue to cut our vegetables. All right, so we have all the shanks in the pan. When you look at this pan, and all pans are a little bit different, it's bowed a little bit at the bottom, so the fat is kind of working its way to the outside of the pan. As these are browning, this now gives me time to kind of start on my next project. So my next project would be I'm gonna get the mirepoix, the vegetables cut, that are gonna go in here after the shanks brown. This is basic mirepoix. So I have 2 cups of onions, 1 cup of celery, 2 cups of carrots, a couple cloves of garlic, rosemary, and thyme. And those are gonna all work their way into the braise, which is gonna add depth of flavor. And these vegetables also taste delicious once everything is cooked. So first thing is onions. Remember, a braise is a long cook. So when you are cutting vegetables for a braise, you don't have to worry so much about them being these small, petite, diced vegetables. They could be a larger cut. One thing that you do want to do though is you want to make sure that everything is roughly the same size. So if you're going with a larger cut on your mirepoix, you want to make sure your carrots, onions, celery are roughly the same size so everything is cooking at an even pace. And I think that's the case whenever you're doing vegetables in a sauce. Just make sure you're consistent. If some of them are small, make them all small. If some of them are big, make them all big. If you like to compost, you could save your scraps, or you could go right into the garbage can with those. Dealer's choice. I prefer to compost, but everyone is a little bit different. Just gonna take that exterior skin off my onion. The onions I peel, carrots, I do not peel, I just clean them real good, get a nice organic carrot, give it a good rinse, and I leave the skins right on. So with the onions, I'm gonna quarter them like that. So you're going down and across. Same thing here. And this is roughly 2 cups. Your ratios, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to sit and measure everything. Kind of eye it up, roughly 2 cups, you're good. And then I'm going 1 cup with my veg, with my carrots and my celery of each. So that's about 1 cup. And then 1 cup of celery, which is gonna be about 2. You could go leaves all the way down to the base. Make sure your celery's washed, and then you can go all the way down to the base. The base of the celery here actually has more flavor than the tip. Pretty much any vegetable, how it grows, always has the most flavor towards the base. Celery is no different than that. All right, let's see where we are here on our shanks. We're getting some good color there. That's what we're looking for. There you go, good caramelization. Perfect. We'll keep those moving. Now, next we're gonna grab a couple cloves of garlic. Again, this is a braise, a long cook. These are gonna cook at 300 for about 4 to 5 hours. So with my garlic, I'm just gonna get a couple cloves, and you could leave these cloves whole because they're gonna release their flavor over that longer period of time. If this was a quicker cook, you would cut everything a little bit smaller because you would want them to release their flavor quicker. You have plenty of time for this to relieve all its flavor. So a tap with the knife, take out the exterior skin, and the garlic is ready to go. Do that with the remaining 2 cloves. And then for my rosemary and thyme, you know, you could tie it up and bundle it. You don't have to, but it's certainly something that you can do. And I'm not gonna chop it, I'm just gonna leave it whole because it's gonna release its flavor slowly. So there's our 3 cloves of garlic, a little bit of rosemary, a little bit of thyme. If you wanted to make your life easier, and what I do often, is I just take a little bit of string, tie it off, and then I'll tie this to the edge of my pan so I could just remove the whole thing very easily once I'm done cooking. And it's, you know, nice little brush too. Let's see how these guys are doing. Keep moving, get kind of all 3 or 4 sides brown. And that is good to go. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about braising, why to braise, why not to braise, etc. So again, meats that you braise are tough cuts of meat. Short ribs, shanks, briskets, shoulders. These are tougher cuts that have tremendous amount of flavor. Way more flavor in a tough cut typically than like a tenderloin. So the shank has 10 times as much flavor as a pork tenderloin. The other great thing about a shank is it's probably, I would say, a quarter or less of the cost of a pork tenderloin. So I love braising, especially in the colder months of the year. This would also be a cut of meat that would work beautifully smoked, because you would cook it for a long time, and it would give it time to break down and for that intermuscular fat to melt, and the things that make the meat a little bit tough to break down and get tender. So to me, braising is one of my favorite cooking techniques. Is it as easy as taking a piece of meat, rubbing it with a little bit of olive oil, salt and pepper, and putting it on a grill? It's not. It takes a little bit more time, but it is cheaper, and it does give you better results when it comes to flavor. And you know, those things work really well for me. I grew up eating Sunday suppers. My mom always made a big feast on Sundays. The family gathered, we ate together. These are great Sunday supper kinds of cuts of meat. So this is browned off. I'm gonna now remove it to my pan here on the side. And then we are going to take our veg. This guy's still got a little bit to go, so I'll let him continue to go in there. We're gonna take our veg and let our veg start to cook in this fat. So we have our onions, our carrots, our herbs, and our garlic. And this is kind of a everybody in the pool situation. We throw those all in. Never miss an opportunity to get the most flavor out of everything we're cooking, including the veg. So you put a sprinkle of salt on the veg at this point. It pulls the moisture out of the veg. It also pulls the natural sweetness out of the veg, and it's gonna make sure that we maximize the flavor of our dish. So wooden spoon, this guy's ready to go now. And we're just gonna start moving our veg around the base of our roasting pan. I'm gonna cook these a little bit past translucent. So a lot of times in a recipe, it'll say sweat a veg, or cook a veg at translucent, or caramelize a veg. The beginning kind of technique is all the same. If you're caramelizing something really deeply, I'd go over a lower heat, but for the most part, you're over medium-high heat. You're gonna move the veg around. I'm gonna let these get a little bit of color to them, and once they start to get color, then I'm gonna start deglazing my pan and adding the layers of flavor from my wine, from my cider, from my stock. That's gonna become my braising liquid that then the shanks are gonna go back in, and that's when they go in the oven. So veg is looking pretty good. First thing that we're gonna add to this is we're gonna add white wine, about 2 cups of white wine. And what the white wine is gonna do is it's gonna deglaze the pan. So when I pour the wine in here, it's gonna pull what I was telling you guys earlier, the fond, or those little brown bits that we form from caramelizing our meat, off the base of the pan into our sauce. There's a tremendous amount of flavor in those little bits. This isn't a step that you wanna skip. This is why when people ask me all the time, can you pressure cook this? Could you cook this in an Instant Pot, a crock pot, any of those things? Can you? Yes. It will. You can put the things in, they will cook. Will you ever get the kind of flavor you get from doing a traditional braise? Absolutely not. So I feel that these kind of techniques are always good to know. And you know, sometimes people are pressed for time. If you're pressed for time, there are different pieces of equipment that could do this quicker. But if you have the time and you want to maximize flavor, this is the way that you want to do it. So we hit the pan with our wine. We're deglazing now. We're going to take our wooden spoon and scrape the bottom of that pan to bring up all those great little brown bits back into our sauce. That wine's gonna just kind of reduce slightly. Once the wine has started to reduce, we're gonna add apple cider. Now, this is just something that I like adding to this braise. I love the taste of pork and apple together, but you could create any flavors you want in your liquid. I use white wine, you could use red wine. I'm using cider. If you want to add something for a different, unique flavor, you could add that too. The key here is I want you to see how much liquid eventually goes in to cook the shanks. One of the important things to know about braising is not boiling. So the meat is not going to be fully submerged into this liquid. We're going to have about a half to a third of the meat above the liquid, so the liquid is going to cook the meat. We could turn it throughout the cooking process. We could baste it if we need to, but we're not boiling the meat, we're braising the meat. Two completely different things. In goes our cider. We're gonna let that come up to temperature. And then the last thing that we will add is we will add our chicken stock. I'm using chicken stock because that is available to me right now. If you made pork stock or you could buy pork stock, that would work. Beef stock would also work. So what I always want to teach people when I'm doing one-on-one classes or any cooking classes is the technique. So the technique that you're learning today is braising. You could take this recipe and this technique and you could use it on any meat that you want to braise. This technique will work for short ribs. This technique will work for ossobuco. This technique would work for a shoulder of meat. Any of those tougher cuts, the braising technique will work. And that's really the most important part of this quote-unquote recipe is the technique. In goes our stock. Now, with the volume of stock you put in here, we gave you a volume amount in the recipe, but I'm gonna get this warm, reseason it, put my shanks in, and then see where they're sitting in the liquid. If I feel that there's enough stock covering them, I'm not gonna add more stock. But I wanna get minimally halfway up the meat. So we're gonna visually see that. So we're grabbing our tasting spoon. Remember, this braising liquid is the liquid that's gonna add flavor to whatever you are braising in it. So if you don't taste this liquid and the liquid is bland, you're going to end up with bland meat. Even though we brined it and did all these things, it's still not gonna reach its full potential. So you need to taste the liquid before you add the meat back in to ensure that you maximize flavor. It's pretty good. I'm pretty good. It does need a little bit more salt and a little bit more pepper. But because we kind of browned all those vegetables a little bit and those herbs in that pan and we deglazed with that wine, all those flavors are really coming through our broth right now, which is very, very important. So we're gonna take our shanks, and when you're looking at any meat that you're about to braise, what I like to look at is cuts of tough meat always have a part on them that is more fat than flesh. The fattier part of the meat is the part that you want out of the liquid. And you could see it on here, like when you look at this, the fattier part is up here, that's gonna go out. Same thing here. It's a little bit easier to identify before you sear them, so you could just kind of take a look and see where they are, and then you're in good shape. And there. So the amount of stock, I actually used half the stock that I called for in the recipe because of the volume of these shanks, because of the size of the pan. You could see where the liquid is on the shanks. That's exactly where I want it to be. So I don't need to add any more stock. We've made sure that it's seasoned. We have our shanks in. The liquid is coming back up to a simmer. It is ready to go in the oven. It's gonna go in a 300-degree oven for about 4 to 5 hours. And what we're looking for at this point is to make sure the meat is tender. We don't wanna cook it to obliviation. Like when people say, oh, it just fell off the bone, completely fell off the bone. We want it to be incredibly tender, but not destroyed. It could still hold to the bone a touch. If you were to put a meat thermometer in here, the meat should be at about 200 degrees. That's when meat becomes tender and pools and all that collagen and the intermuscular fat is broken down. So you're gonna put it in that 300-degree oven. It's gonna go to about 4 to 5 hours. When it reaches 200 degrees internally, technically it's done, but as long as you don't go over 210 internally, that meat is gonna be cooked perfectly. So that's what we're looking for. So I'm gonna open my oven. In goes the meat. We will see you in about 4 hours. Stick around. All right, you guys, the shanks have come out of the oven. They look perfect. You could see they have some nice caramelization on the top. That's what we're looking for. That is the benefit of having them slightly exposed as they cook. You could baste them. We basted them 1 or 2 times as they were going through the oven, so just taking that liquid and going across the top. If you feel that that meat is drying out a little bit while they're cooking, you could actually turn them and let the other side start to caramelize a little bit too. Now, what we're gonna do is I'm gonna pull these out of the liquid and I am gonna strain the liquid. You can see how incredibly tender these are. And then we're gonna take this liquid and pour it back over our shanks and let them sit in that liquid overnight. Now, I know a lot of you are sitting there at home and going, man, chef, you have lost your mind. You just gave us a 3-day method how to cook pork shanks. This is a little bit of a timely process. I don't want you to get discouraged though and say, I'm not making these, they're gonna take 3 days. Because in reality, omit the brine, do the standard braise, and eat them right when they come out of the oven. What I always want to show is the perfect world or maximum flavor. So if you are looking for maximum flavor, like this is how we would do them if we were when we make pork shanks at one of our fine dining restaurants. If you're looking for maximum flavor, this is the way to attain maximum flavor. Is it the only way to braise a pork shank? It is not. If you wanted to have them the day that you got them, you could not brine, you could brown and sear, you could create your liquid, you could braise them for 4 hours, you could take them out of the oven, you can eat. But with every step that we've added to this, it adds a little bit more deliciousness, a little bit more flavor, and a little bit more moisture. So when I strain this liquid and pour it back over my shanks, it's going to allow the shanks to kind of absorb some of this braising liquid back in to ensure that they're incredibly juicy. And it'll also give me the opportunity to skim some fat off the broth after it chills. So when I reheat them, there's not that extra fat floating through the broth. So we put the liquid in the strainer. I'm just going to take a wooden spoon to push all that remaining liquid through. This liquid is then going to go on top of our shanks. We're going to put it in the refrigerator overnight to allow the shanks to absorb some of the liquid, allow the fat to float to the top so we could skim it. And then when we get back, we're going to warm the whole thing up. And finally, 3 days later, we're going to enjoy our pork shanks. Into the fridge with you. See you in a bit. All right, you guys, the pork shanks have come out of the fridge. We placed them on the stovetop. We brought them back up to temperature. We made sure we skimmed any of that excess fat that may have floated to the top while they were chilling. All right, guys, so here's the deal. You could take this recipe. You could put all the ingredients in an Instapot. It'll be good. You could take this recipe. You could eliminate the brine and letting it sit in the liquid overnight and just do a classic braise in like 5 hours. It'll be very good. Or you could brine, you can braise, you could let sit in the liquid overnight and then reheat, and it'll be porkalicious, fantastic, the best braised shank you have ever had. And really, that's always what I'm looking for, how to create maximum flavor. So we take that shank, we place it down on our plate. You could see it's incredibly juicy. It's still very hot, but it's tender, but it still has a little bit of fork to it. That's what you're looking for in a braise. You don't want the meat to be completely obliviated. And so it has that nice caramelization on top from when we left it exposed as it was cooking. and it's gonna have the flavor of the cider, the coriander, the bay leaf, the herbs that we put in there. The deep, rich flavors of a shank. There's nothing like it. A pork tenderloin cannot touch this. And taking those extra steps with the brine, letting it sitting in the liquid overnight, it just takes a very humble dish and puts it over the top. So I want you guys to keep cooking. Take your time. Enjoy the meal. It's going to be delicious.